Hello, I'm William Taggart, author of Fixing America, and this is Episode 2, The Coming Crisis, Energy Transition. So in Episode 1, we talked about climate change, and I showed how I downloaded the National Weather Service data to try and get my mind around climate change. And what I ended up creating were these graphs that showed the temperature maximum for every year, the average maximum for every year across time to figure out if climate change is real. Now, this is California. You can see that very near in the 2011 to 2020 region, they're seeing a definite uptick in temperatures. But this is Arkansas. Arkansas saw its hottest temperatures in the 1930s, 1950s, when it was hit with massive heat waves. The heat waves in the 1930s were related to the events of the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma, Texas, and Nebraska. So when we talk about red states not believing in climate change, the thing we have to understand is the red states aren't seeing it the same. States like Arkansas, Missouri, and others aren't seeing climate change in the same manner that California is. But the problem we have is that a lot of the climate change activists are creating a lot of drama, creating a lot of fear around climate change, and that's having an impact. It's causing young people to take up activism and to do things like these two who have thrown tomato soup on a Van Gogh painting and have now glued themselves to the wall. So if you're an activist out there, let me tell you, this is probably not going to work. Most of the people in charge are not going to believe you because they understand something. And that is that there's a practical reason for not banning oil. If you were to ban all new drilling in the United States, within 18 months, shale production would drop by 50%. We would lose almost 5 million barrels a day of oil production. And that would have a massive impact. Now, the thing you need to understand is you can't build electric vehicles or renewables fast enough to avoid this. You will create an energy shortage. And on the natural gas side, it's just as bad. In 1 year, you lose 25 billion cubic feet per day of production. That's almost a quarter of our natural gas production. And that would leave shortages in heating and in electricity generation. So banning oil is not a good idea. Banning drilling is not a good idea. So does that mean it's drill baby drill time? Well, not so fast. So I want to give you a practical reason for why we do need an energy transition. In the 1950s, a gentleman named Hubert worked for Shell as a geologist, and he wrote a paper that predicted that U.S. domestic oil production would peak in the 1970s. And he was right. It peaked in 1970 at 10 million barrels per day. Now, later on, we brought on Alaska production, and then we brought on deep water production, and eventually shale came online, and shale rewrote the rules. Now, you can argue that shale has allowed us to exceed that 10 million barrels a day, and therefore Hubert was wrong. But the reality is that in the 1950s, nobody thought shale was a possibility. So within the context of what he knew, Hubert was right. Now, the thing is, we have this massive increase in shale production, but nobody seems to understand it's probably going to peak and go into decline as well. So the Permian Basin, the Permian field is the biggest shale field right now in West Texas and New Mexico. And this is the part of it called the Midland Basin. The picture on the left of what's been drilled, the picture on the right is what's undrilled. Now this is from a few years ago. The dark green is the Tier 1 acreage. It has the most barrels of oil per acre. The red is the Tier 5. It has the least amount of barrels per acre. We've used up pretty much all of the Tier 1 acreage. As you have to drill into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 acreage, you have to drill more wells to get the same level of production that you got out of the Tier 1. That creates what's called the Red Queen effect. Now, the Red Queen effect, the Red Queen reference comes from Lewis and Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, when Alice asked the Red Queen, "How are you doing?" And her response is, "Now here you see it takes all the running you can do just to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast." What that means for the shale industry is that as you use up that Tier 1 acreage, eventually you reach a point where you've got to increase your level of drilling to maintain production, to add more production to replace the barrels that have declined. So the declining production, all that drilling is going into just replacing what has declined, and you end up at a point where you can't maintain your production level, and eventually it goes into decline, which is what they call the Red Queen. In 2024, the U.S. completed 11,731 new wells and put them online. But from December 2023 to December 2024, we saw very little change in production. On the oil side, we saw an increase of 183,000 barrels per day. But of that, Texas and New Mexico generated 252,000 barrels per day, which means the rest of the United States declined by 69,000 barrels per day. On the natural gas side, we saw an increase of production of 0.9 billion cubic feet per day. But again, Texas and New Mexico generated 2.9 billion cubic feet per day of increase, whereas the rest of the United States declined by 2 billion cubic feet per day. So without the Permian, we would have had an overall decrease in production. So why is that important? Well, it's important because more and more experts are beginning to talk about the Permian peaking in 3 to 8 years. Different people are saying different things. But during the March 2025 CERAWeek conference, the CEO of Oxy Petroleum said she thought it would be 5 years. And that's showing up in the numbers I'm looking at. Okay, so what does it mean about the Permian peaking in 5 years? Well, one of the problems we have to look at is we're increasing our liquefied natural gas export capacity. In the next 4 years, we're about to double the amount of natural gas that we can turn into a liquid and export to other countries. Now, what's the problem there is, how are you going to get more natural gas to supply these LNG export facilities? That's the challenge. But before we discuss that, we need to understand proven reserves versus possible reserves. The oil industry talks about two different numbers. One is proven reserves, and the other is possible reserves. So for proven reserves, you want to think of that like an area where the streets have been laid, the water lines are in place, the sewage lines are in place. As a realtor, you can be pretty sure they're going to build houses here, houses that you will be able to sell. And that's because proven reserves have a 90% likelihood of happening. But possible reserves are like a stretch of land out on the edge of town. You don't know if anybody's going to build houses there or not, because possible reserves all have a less than 10% chance of happening. And that's the thing you have to understand, is when we talk about reserves, we need to understand which number we're talking about. The smaller proven reserve number, which has a 90% chance of occurring, or the higher possible reserve number, which only has a 10% chance of happening. Now let's see how that applies to the Haynesville Shale. In the discussions right now, everybody agrees that liquefied natural gas export capacity is going to increase. We're going to build more natural gas power plants. So all the experts are talking about the Haynesville having to step up and provide that extra natural gas. Now, as you can see here on this map, the red areas are where we have the thickest shale properties. We have the best natural gas cubic feet per acre. The blue areas are where we have the less. And if you look at the existing wells, we've drilled most of our wells in the red, orange, and yellow areas. Now, what's the implication there? So this is a chart generated by the Energy Information Agency and Administration. It was released in June 2023, so it's based on 2022 data. As you pull more natural gas out of the Haynesville Shale, you need a higher price, because as you use up the best acreage, the lesser quality acreage needs a higher dollars per million BTU price to generate profit. So I figure right now we're somewhere in this area. We've used about 15 trillion cubic feet of natural gas since 2022 has been pulled out of the Haynesville Shale, and we're in the $3 to $4 range. Now, that makes sense because the pricing we're seeing right now for natural gas is all $4 per million BTUs. Now, for proven reserves, the Haynesville is listed at 120 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and that corresponds here. And it corresponds with a much higher price. When you talk about possible reserves, the Haynesville is considered to have 200 TCF. So it's called technically recoverable. The key reason why the possible reserves are called technically recoverable is we have the technology. You can drill a well and produce natural gas from this area. But the problem is the money it costs and the energy required to drill that well and put it on production is more than the energy and money you would get from the well. And that's why it's not considered economic. One of the key things you need to understand is possible reserves are not economic under the present technology. That doesn't mean we can't have a technological breakthrough that'll make them economic, but at the moment, that's just not possible. And the thing we need to understand is that nationally, we have proven reserves of 700 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and we burn about 45 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year. The possible reserves are 4,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So that's the thing. When people tell you that there's years and years of natural gas, 80 years, 100 years of natural gas, they're using those possible reserves numbers, which are less than 10% chance of happening. We need to think in terms of our proven reserves, of which there's only 700 TCF when we burn 45 TCF a year. So the thing I'm worried about is we're facing a potential natural gas shortage, and we had the same event in 1975. So in 1970, U.S. domestic oil production peaked. But the demand for natural gas continued even though production declined, and it left a 2.9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas shortfall. This caused the Federal Energy Administration, which was the precursor of the Department of Energy, in 1975 to work a study at the order of the president to look at the upcoming natural gas shortages. So my point is, we've been here before. We've seen natural gas shortages in 1974. There were articles in the New York Times laying out how the natural gas shortage was going to impact, causing plants to close, a loss of jobs, and a curtailment in natural gas supplies. This continued into the 1970s. In 1977, this article talked about how the automobile industry had furloughed 56,000 workers and that electric power plants were not able to get enough natural gas to operate. And they were requesting that people use as little natural gas as possible. So the thing you've got to look at is, this is our natural gas production. We had a shortage here in the 1970s, 1974 to 1978. The question is not if, but when we're going to have a second shortage. And my concern is that this rising peak of shale gas is going to have a shortage sometime in the next 3 to 5 years, and we're not prepared for it. And that's the thing that really concerns me, is we don't have a 20-year energy policy, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So I'll leave you with this text that I wrote in the book, Fixing America. Disregarding climate change, some will see no reason to do anything differently, no reason to walk away from hydrocarbons and the cheap energy that it provides to power an economy. And that's what we're seeing now, with a lot of people saying that we don't need to change. But the reality is, fossil fuels were never going to be a long-term solution. We were always going to encounter a point where they peaked and then went into decline. And that point is coming soon. And it's something we need to start working on to fix America. Thank you very much. If you want, you can follow me on Blue Sky, or you can follow on Substack. The book is Fixing America. The website is fixingamericathebook.com. On the website, you can find out where to buy the book, and it also has a link to the data tables. All the data tables that I use to generate the book are available for you to look at and review. Thank you very much, and I hope you look forward to the next episode.